It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that felt ordinary and unremarkable, the air thick with the promise of autumn, but still clinging to the last vestiges of summer's heat. Inside the quiet, sterile confines of the Greenbrook family clinic, a different kind of stillness settled over the examination room. A 6-year-old girl named Lena sat on the crisp paper of the examination table, her small frame dwarfed by the pristine white of the room. Her father, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually worried expression named Daniel, stood beside her, his hand resting on her back in a gesture meant to be reassuring, but that seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension. Lena didn't fidget. She didn't hum or draw with the crayons the nurse had offered her. She simply sat, her gaze fixed on a spot on the wall, just above the doctor's head, her body rigid with a stillness that was deeply unnatural for a child her age. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a stillness that was louder than any scream. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man who had spent over 20 years in family practice, felt the first, faint stirrings of unease. He had seen thousands of children, from the boisterously healthy to the fearfully sick, but this was something different. It wasn't simple shyness or discomfort. It was a practiced, desperate quietude. He made a note in her chart, his pen a whisper against the paper, and tried to engage her. "So, Lena," he said, his voice gentle and warm, "your dad says you've been having some tummy troubles. Can you tell me what they feel like?" Lena's head remained perfectly still, her eyes unwavering. Her father, Daniel, cleared his throat, a nervous sound. "She doesn't talk much about it," he offered. "Just complains about the pain. She hasn't been eating well." Dr. Thorne nodded, his eyes flicking between the girl and the man. He noticed Daniel's grip on Lena's shoulder tighten for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of control that was gone as quickly as it appeared. He made another note. Lena's behavior, the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever her father spoke, was a red flag, but it was a faint one, easy to dismiss on a busy day. But Dr. Thorne had learned to trust his instincts. The stillness of a child was a profound anomaly. He continued the examination, his movements slow and deliberate, all while watching the silent exchange between father and daughter. He pressed gently on her abdomen. Lena winced, but didn't cry out. Her gaze shifted for the first time, a quick, darting glance at her father, a silent plea that seemed to say, I'm trying. Daniel responded with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a moment so fleeting, so easily missed, that Dr. Thorne almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But he hadn't. That moment, that single, silent communication of fear and command, will be the thread that unraveled everything. He decided to perform an ultrasound, a routine procedure for abdominal pain that could help rule out a number of possibilities. As he prepared the gel and the transducer, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Lena's stillness became more pronounced, her small fists clenching the paper beneath her. Daniel watched Dr. Thorne with a gaze that had grown guarded, the fatigue in his eyes replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. Dr. Thorne spread the cool gel over Lena's lower abdomen, the sudden cold shocking her into a barely-there flinch. He placed the transducer against her skin, and the screen beside him flickered to life, showing the black and gray landscape of her internal world. He began to move the wand, slowly scanning her organs, his mind ticking through the possibilities. An inflamed appendix, a gallstone, a simple bowel obstruction. But as the image on the screen resolved, his practiced eye immediately caught something that was not only out of place, but profoundly, unnervingly impossible. It was a shape, a mass that was far too large, too dense, and too regular to be any ordinary medical issue. He moved the transducer again, zooming in, his heart rate quickening. He saw the distinct outlines, the clear, sharp edges, the geometric precision. This was not a biological object. This was something man-made. The silence in the room was now absolute. Daniel's breath seemed to hitch in his throat. His face, which had been a mask of polite concern, hardened into a different kind of mask altogether, one of naked fury and silent dread. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the screen, on the impossible shape that had appeared there, a silent acknowledgement that the game was up. Dr. Thorne's hand on the transducer trembled. The shape was small, no bigger than a centimeter in its widest dimension, but its implications were vast and terrifying. It was lodged deep within Lena's abdominal wall, but it was not a tumor or a cyst. Its composition was too regular, its edges too sharp. The doctor felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The girl's strange behavior, the father's subtle commands, the impossible object on the screen, it all cohered into a single, terrifying narrative. He had stumbled not upon a medical mystery, but on a crime. He lifted the transducer from Lena's stomach, the sound of it parting from her skin a small, jarring noise in the suffocating silence. He looked at Daniel, and in that moment, all pretense was gone. There was no need for words. The knowledge, a shared and horrifying secret, passed between them in a single, silent gaze. Dr. Thorne knew he had to get help. He knew he was in a precarious position. The man standing before him was no longer a worried father. He was a potential perpetrator, cornered and dangerous. The little girl on the table was no longer just a patient. She was a witness and a victim. The ordinary afternoon had been shattered, revealing a dark, hidden truth. The tranquility of the clinic was an illusion. The real world, the one of quiet desperation and unimaginable cruelty, had just broken through the surface, and Dr. Thorne found himself standing on the precipice, looking into the abyss. The seconds that followed stretched into an eternity, filled with the unspoken tension of a predator and its would-be prey. Dr. Thorne's hand, still clutching the ultrasound transducer, felt clammy with sweat. The impossible image on the screen remained frozen, a digital ghost of the truth. Daniel, Lena's father, took a step forward, his shadow falling over the examination table. His voice was low, devoid of its earlier polite cadence, and it carried a chilling, deliberate weight. "What did you see?" he asked, the words a cold command rather than a question. Dr. Thorne didn't answer. He was already thinking, his mind racing through 100 different scenarios. He needed to get Lena out of the room, to get her to a place of safety, but he knew any sudden movement, any overt act of defiance, would trigger a reaction he couldn't afford to risk. He glanced at the door, but it felt a million miles away. Lena, for her part, remained a statue of fear, her eyes fixed on her father's face, a look of profound, heart-wrenching terror etched into her small features. It was the face of a child who had seen too much, who understood the precariousness of her own safety in a way no child ever should. Dr. Thorne took a deep, steadying breath. He had to play for time. It's just some sort of foreign body, he said, his voice as calm and neutral as he could make it. It's not biological. We'll need to do more tests. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He was a man accustomed to lies, to the subtle art of deception, and he could see through Thorne's pretense with chilling clarity. What kind of foreign body? He pressed, his tone growing more insistent. Dr. Thorne didn't flinch. I'm not sure. We need to get a specialist in here. I'll need to make a call. He reached for the phone on the wall, a simple act that was meant to seem routine, but was in fact a desperate gamble. He was going to dial the police. He was going to get the words, "I need help, there's a child in danger," out before Daniel could stop him. But Daniel was faster. In a single, fluid motion, he was at the doctor's side, his hand clamping down on Thorne's arm with surprising strength. The grip was a silent warning, a testament to the man's coiled, physical power. "No calls," Daniel said, his voice a low growl. "Not yet." He leaned in, his breath a foul whisper against the doctor's ear. "You're going to tell me what you saw. You're going to tell me what that is." The doctor's mind raced, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to be strategic. He had to survive this encounter and protect the child. He looked at Lena again, and in that moment, a flicker of something new appeared in her eyes. It was not just fear, but a desperate, fleeting plea for him to understand. She wanted him to see, to truly see, what he had found. Thorne knew he couldn't simply give in, but he also knew he couldn't escalate the situation without potentially putting Lena in even more danger. He chose a path of calculated compliance. "I'm not a radiologist," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I can't say for certain. It's just a shape. A tiny piece of metal, perhaps. It's not a medical emergency, just something that needs to be removed. We should book her into the hospital for a minor procedure." The suggestion of a public hospital, of a full team of doctors and nurses, seemed to give Daniel pause. He considered it for a moment, his gaze shifting back to the screen, to the silent, irrefutable evidence of his crime. He didn't know if Thorne was bluffing, but the idea of a sterile, controlled environment, surrounded by other professionals, was a threat he couldn't easily dismiss. It was here, in the cold light of the examination room, that the first layer of the deception began to peel away. The object on the screen, a small, intricate device, wasn't just a foreign body. It was an antenna, a miniature, biologically integrated radio frequency antenna. The discovery had a shocking, immediate impact on the investigators who would later examine the file. It was a technological marvel and a grotesque act of human cruelty, a fusion of advanced engineering and profound depravity. The question was no longer simply what was wrong with the child, but what was being done to her. And for what purpose? This wasn't abuse in the traditional sense. This was something else entirely, something far more calculated and chilling. The team that would eventually descend upon the case, a small, highly specialized unit from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, would later describe their first review of the files as a journey from incomprehension to horror. The initial reports from Dr. Thorne, the medical scans, and the child behavioral assessment painted a picture that was both deeply disturbing and baffling. There was the obvious psychological trauma, the profound, almost catatonic state of the child. But then there was the physical evidence, the impossible object, and the strange, quiet precision of the crime. The BU agent in charge of the case, a seasoned investigator named Sarah Jensen, would later recount how the file landed on her desk like a stone, heavy with a weight she couldn't yet articulate. Her initial thought, like Dr. Thorne's, was one of neglect or physical abuse. But as she read through the reports, as she looked at the detailed scans of the device, her professional curiosity slowly gave way to a dawning sense of dread. The object, once removed and analyzed by forensic engineers, was revealed to be a highly sophisticated, miniaturized passive transponder. It had no power source of its own. It was designed to be activated and tracked by an external signal. The implications were staggering. It meant that Lena was not just a victim of abuse. She was an item, a beacon, a point of data in a larger, more sinister scheme. The placement of the device, so deeply and carefully embedded in her abdominal wall, suggested not an act of random violence, but a long-planned, meticulous operation. The crime had been committed with cold, clinical precision, a horrifying marriage of technology and malevolence. The investigation was no longer about a single case of child abuse. It was about a hidden world, a network operating in the shadows, using people, using children, as part of a grotesque system. Lena's silence, once a symptom of her terror, now took on a new, more profound meaning. It wasn't just fear. It was the silence of a pawn, a captured piece in a game whose rules and players were still unknown, but whose stakes were unimaginably high. The initial assumptions, so neat and contained, had been shattered. The truth was far more complex, a sprawling and horrifying conspiracy that reached into places no one had ever thought to look. The investigators, led by Agent Jensen, were now operating in a different dimension of crime. The father, Daniel, once the primary suspect, was now viewed through a new lens. He was still a perpetrator, to be sure, but his actions now seemed less like those of a lone abuser and more like those of a guardian, a handler, an obedient player in a game with far higher stakes. The forensic analysis of the transponder, that impossibly small and intricate piece of technology, became the new center of the investigation. The device itself was a marvel of engineering. It was made of a non-reactive polymer shell and a tiny, almost microscopic core of an unknown alloy. It had no discernible markings, no serial numbers, nothing that could trace it back to a manufacturer. The engineers who studied it were baffled by its sophistication. The passive transponder required no internal power source. It was designed to be activated by a specific, high-frequency external signal. It would then use the energy from that signal to transmit a unique identification code in a tiny burst of biodata. The implications were staggering. Lena was, in effect, a walking, breathing sensor, a piece of a larger, unseen network. The investigation shifted from a single-family tragedy to a wide-ranging hunt for the creators and operators of this network. The BU team began to re-examine all of Daniel's known contacts, his financial records, his travel history. They found nothing that pointed to a larger criminal organization. His life was, on the surface, a picture of suburban normalcy. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, lived in a quiet cul-de-sac, and had no criminal record. He was, to all appearances, just a worried father. But that facade had been irrevocably cracked by the image on Dr. Thorne's ultrasound screen. They knew he was part of something, and his very normalcy was a tool of his deception. Agent Jensen authorized a full-scale surveillance operation. They watched Daniel's house, his movements, the places he visited. For weeks, there was nothing. No suspicious meetings, no strange packages, no coded messages. The man's life was a predictable, mind-numbing repetition of work, home, and the occasional grocery run. The investigators were running into a wall. The mystery deepened. If Lena was a beacon, who was tracking her? And for what purpose? The forensic analysts, in a desperate attempt to find a lead, began to meticulously deconstruct the transponder. It was a painstaking, almost impossible task. They discovered that the core alloy was not of any known composition. It was a metal that had been engineered for a specific purpose, one that allowed it to absorb and emit energy with extraordinary efficiency. It was a metal that shouldn't have existed in the hands of a suburban accountant. This discovery sent the investigation into a new direction. This wasn't a standard criminal operation. This was something that required immense resources, advanced scientific knowledge, and a chilling disregard for human life. The new line of inquiry led them away from the traditional world of organized crime and into the murky, shadowy world of black market science and clandestine research. They began to cross-reference the unique composition of the alloy with known research and development projects. They looked at military contractors, at cutting-edge tech companies, at small, privately funded research labs. The search was a haystack, a sprawling, global hunt for a needle that might not even exist. The investigators felt a growing sense of desperation. The little girl, Lena, was in safe hands now, but she was a walking, living monument to a crime they couldn't fully comprehend. Her quiet, withdrawn demeanor was not a sign of fear, but of profound, deep-seated trauma. The silent terror she had carried with her was a reflection of a truth that was far too big for a child to bear, and now it was a truth that was beginning to swallow the investigators whole. They needed to find the source of the transponder. They needed to find the people who had created it, who had put it inside a little girl, who were now waiting for a signal that would tell them what they needed to know. They needed to understand the rules of the game so they could finally, mercifully, end it. The investigators felt the clock ticking. They knew that the technology was designed for a purpose, and that purpose, whatever it was, could not be good. The question that haunted Agent Jensen's mind, the one she would repeat over and over again in her mind, was simple and terrifying. What was Lena's purpose? What data was the tiny device meant to collect? What did they intend to do with her? The answers, she knew, would be far more horrifying than anything they had imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place, not from a high-tech forensic lab or a digital surveillance report, but from the meticulously cataloged medical files of a different, seemingly unrelated case. A junior analyst on Agent Jensen's team, tasked with the mind-numbing work of cross-referencing Daniel's professional network with an obscure database of scientific papers, noticed a name that had been flagged for an entirely different reason. The name was Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch was a brilliant but disgraced bioengineer who had worked for a major defense contractor several years prior. He had been fired and blackballed from the scientific community after a scandal involving unauthorized human trials of a new, experimental transdermal delivery system. The details of the case were murky, but the key phrase that leaped out at the analyst was passive microtransponder. It was a phrase that had been deemed a fabrication at the time, a conspiracy theory used to discredit a brilliant but reckless scientist. The connection was tentative, circumstantial at best, but it was the only lead they had. They began to dig into Finch's history, and the truth, slowly but horrifyingly, began to emerge. Finch had not just been an eccentric scientist. He had been a radical, a man obsessed with the idea of a fully integrated human data network. He had a theory, one he had been working on for years, that the human body could be used as a biological antenna, a living receiver and transmitter of data. His goal was to create a network of human beings, all connected through these transponders, to create a collective consciousness, a hive mind. It was a delusion of staggering proportions, a mad scientist's fever dream. But the alloy, the unique composition of the metal core in Lena's transponder, was Finch's own creation, a proprietary formula he had developed in his rogue lab. The paper the analyst had found was an early draft, unpublished and suppressed, outlining his theories and the properties of his AI metal, which was so named because it was designed to interact with the body's subtle bioelectric fields. Finch had not been acting alone. He had been funded by a secretive, a small cabal of powerful individuals who shared his radical, techno-utopian vision. They believed that the human species was on the brink of collapse and that the only way to save it was to evolve beyond individual consciousness. They saw themselves as the architects of a new world, a world where the human mind was a shared resource, where fear, pain, and suffering could be monitored and mitigated by a central, controlling intelligence. And the children, the victims like Lena, were the first test subjects, the first fragile nodes in this monstrous network. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying inevitability. Daniel, the worried father, was not a lone abuser. He was a follower, a devoted member of Finch's cult, a true believer in the madman's vision. He had willingly given his daughter over to the project, seeing her not as a child to be protected, but as a sacrifice for the greater good. The stomach pain was a side effect of the device's integration, a physical symptom of the bioengineering. The subtle commands, the silent terror, the girl's profound stillness. It was all a result of her conditioning, a process designed to make her a compliant and passive node. The investigators felt a cold revulsion. This was not a crime driven by greed or malice in the traditional sense. It was a crime born of a twisted, delusional ideology, a crime against the very concept of human individuality. The goal was not to harm the children for harm's sake, but to use them, to exploit their innocence and their vulnerability for a purpose they deemed noble. But in its execution, it was a profound act of evil, a violation of the most fundamental bond between a parent and a child. The search for Finch and his collaborators became a global manhunt. They were a small, insular group, but they were well-funded and highly intelligent. They had vanished, gone underground, leaving behind no digital footprint, no paper trail. They had anticipated a discovery and had meticulously covered their tracks. They had created a network of sleeper nodes, children like Lena who were living normal lives, unaware of the technology implanted inside them, waiting for the signal that would activate the network. The terror was not just what they had already done, but what they were preparing to do. The investigators were in a race against time, a race to find the perpetrators before they could initiate their monstrous vision. They knew the signal was coming. They knew that at some point, Finch and his followers would activate the network, and the horror of their plan would be unleashed on the world. Lena's small, brave quietness had been a blessing, a warning that had led them to this truth, but it was also a ticking clock, a silent countdown to a future they were desperate to prevent. The final act of the story was not a dramatic confrontation or a high-speed chase, but a slow, agonizing descent into the heart of the conspiracy. Agent Jensen's team, armed with a new understanding of Finch's project, began to search for other nodes within the network. They had a profile now, children with seemingly normal lives, whose fathers fit a certain psychological profile, a blend of intellectual arrogance and profound ideological devotion. The search was a meticulous and chilling process, combing through medical records and school attendance files, looking for the tiny anomalies that had first flagged Lena's case. They found them, one by one. 2 children in suburban Ohio, a girl in upstate New York, a boy in rural Pennsylvania. The pattern was always the same: a seemingly ordinary family, an intelligent and controlling father, and a child with a quiet, unsettling stillness. The horror was not in the details of each individual case, but in the sheer scale of the operation. It was a network, just as Finch had intended, a grotesque web of human experimentation stretching across the country, all waiting for a signal. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source: a low-frequency radio burst intercepted by a military intelligence satellite. It was not a message, but a data transmission, a series of complex pulses that seemed to be scanning for something. The analysts at the agency recognized the signature immediately. It was the signal, the activation code Finch had been waiting for. They were running out of time. They knew Finch and his collaborators had to be in a location with a powerful, long-range transmitter. The search was narrowed down to a few high-power military and scientific installations in remote areas of the country. One of them, a decommissioned radio observatory in the arid plains of New Mexico, fit the profile perfectly. It was a place of isolation, a place where a madman could conduct his monstrous symphony without interruption. A tactical team was dispatched. The scene they found was a tableau of profound technological and psychological derangement. Finch, a gaunt, wild-eyed man with a halo of white hair, was at the center of a makeshift control room, surrounded by monitors and wires. He was a conductor, orchestrating a human network, his face a mask of serene, terrifying conviction. As the team breached the door, Finch didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply looked at them with a look of pity, a look that said they were too late, too small to understand the magnificent evolution he was initiating. He looked at Agent Jensen and said, his voice a quiet whisper, "It is done. The collective is awakening. The silence is over." The team found a transmitter, a massive, jury-rigged contraption humming with an unholy power. They shut it down. They confiscated the data logs and the schematics. But the damage, they knew, had already been done. They had found Finch and his collaborators, and they had dismantled their operation, but they could not erase what had already been set in motion. The activation signal had been sent. The network was now a reality. In the aftermath, the investigators were left with a profound sense of tragic victory. They had caught the criminals, but the crime was still a living, breathing thing. The children, the silent nodes, had all been identified and were now being cared for, their transponders carefully removed by surgeons. But the psychological trauma, the violation of their innocence, would linger for a lifetime. Lena, the first node discovered, the one whose quiet fear had started this chain of events, was now in the care of a loving foster family. She had begun to speak, her voice a small, fragile thing, like a bird's first song after a long, dark winter. But her eyes still held that unsettling stillness, the remnant of a silence that was a testament to a horrific experiment. The case of the silent network was never fully understood by the public. The details were classified, the true extent of the conspiracy deemed too disturbing for the public consciousness. But for Agent Jensen and her team, and for the brave doctors like Eris Thorne who first dared to look a little closer, it was a chilling reminder of the evil that can exist in the pursuit of a twisted ideal. It was a story of a child's quiet fear and a doctor's brave decision, a story that began in a sterile room and ended with the quiet unraveling of a monstrous vision, a story that will forever be a testament to the fact that the most profound horrors are often born not in the darkness, but in the blinding, artificial light of an impossible dream.